Ялta is one of those historical myths which, it seems, is impossible to dislodge. The myth is that the great powers agreed in the Crimea to divide up Europe into spheres of influence, and that the conference of the three powers thereby laid the groundwork for the Cold War. This myth has been debunked repeatedly by reputable commentators and historians. Jean Sevilla in France, Conrad Black in the United States. But it remains in place. You only have to type a new Yalta into Google to see what I mean. There are plenty of articles in reputable media or from think tanks, recent articles repeating the myth that Yalta was where Europe was carved up. Now, there are two things arresting about this myth. The first is that it is unhistorical. The carve-up of Europe, if that is what it was, did not start until 1947 for Poland and Romania and 1948 for Czechoslovakia, when pro-Soviet communist regimes took power in those countries. Even Churchill's Fulton speech, the Iron Curtain speech, was not given until 1946. Maybe the Cold War was inevitable, but only with the benefit of hindsight, because it clearly had nothing to do with Yalta. Quite the contrary. It may be true that the general idea of spheres of influence existed. The infamous percentages agreement between Churchill and Stalin had occurred in Moscow in October 1944, but obviously that had no legal status. Far from dividing the world up into spheres of influence, the Crimea Conference, on the contrary, provided for the creation of the United Nations to try to guarantee peace in the world. This creation then, of course, duly took place a few months later, in the summer of 1945, with full Soviet participation. The second aspect of the myth, and this perhaps explains its tenacity, is that it is ideological. Behind the claim that Britain and America agreed to sell Eastern Europe down the river to Stalin lies an ideological hostility to the very idea of great powers playing a role in international politics. This ideology was made explicit in Lenin's Decree on Peace in November 1917 and in Woodrow Wilson's 14-point speech to the United States Congress in January 1918. Both the Bolshevik leader and the American president promised an end to secret diplomacy and territorial annexation. These views in turn, are the product of the liberal idealist school of international relations. The idea that power politics should not play any role in world affairs, but that world affairs should instead be based on international organizations and shared values. According to this theory, great powers are guilty until proved innocent, forever suspected of pursuing their own self-interest at the expense of weaker states. This conviction is very old. It doesn't date from the time of Yalta. On the contrary, Henri Comte de Saint-Simon expressed it when he attacked the Congress of Vienna even before it had started. Peace could never come from negotiations between states, he argued in October 1814. Instead, Europe would be at peace only when all states adopted the same political regime and agreed to be placed under the control of what Saint-Simon already then called a European Parliament. The alternative vision, that of a balance of power as the key to peace, has inevitably enjoyed less support from ideologues who prefer ideas to reality. The balance of power was, of course, institutionalized in the United Nations with the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, precisely what was agreed at Yalta. And as Metternich Secretary Friedrich von Gentz had argued already in 1800, in a reply to Kant's 1795 essay on eternal peace, the balance of power was as favourable to weaker states as to stronger ones, since weaker states have a greater room for manoeuvre in a system of separate alliances than they do in general or permanent alliances of the kind proposed by Kant and the Abbé de Saint-Pierre. The United Nations is precisely not an alliance, unlike all the other liberal idealist plans for eternal peace, which have been put forward ever since the mid-15th century, when a plan for permanent European peace was proposed by George Podiebrad, the King of Bohemia, up to and including the League of Nations created at Versailles after the First World War, for which Woodrow Wilson envisaged a punitive regime of economic sanctions for any state which refused to submit to its arbitration. Unlike the League, the United Nations, at least in its original 1945 form, is a system in which competing powers can operate. It's not an alliance. It may have grown out of an alliance, but it is not in itself an alliance. Instead, it is a system, and its survival since 1945 is largely thanks to that fact. It's no coincidence that liberal internationalists have been calling for the abolition of the United Nations or for the expulsion of Russia from the United Nations since at least 2022. Liberal internationalism precisely cannot tolerate states which are not liberal or which do not claim to be liberal. For their very existence, the very existence of such states, is a denial of the universality of liberalism, of the claims to universality which liberalism makes. And it's for this reason that liberalism invariably leads to war, and that it can never be the basis of an international system.